Good morning, everyone. Thank you to our witnesses for being here today. And I would like everyone to know that this meeting was scheduled before what happened in Cuba. It's not that I was prophetic, it's just that it so happens that it's very apropos to have this hearing today. This hearing, entitled Historic Protests in Cuba and the Crackdown on Free Expression, will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess of the committee at any point, and all members will have 5 days to submit statements, strenuous materials, and questions for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. To insert something into the record, please have your staff email previously mentioned address and contact subcommittee staff. As a reminder to members joining remotely, please keep your video function at all times, even when you're not recognized by the chair. Members are responsible for muting and unmuting themselves, and please remember to mute yourself after you finish speaking. Consistent with H.R. Res. 8 and the accompanying regulations, staff will only mute members and witnesses as appropriate when they're not under recognition to eliminate background noise. I see that we have a quorum, and I now recognize myself for opening remarks. What we have witnessed over the last week in Cuba is nothing short of historic. Cubans have taken to the streets by the thousands to call for freedom and democracy. They have been clear in demanding an end to the dictatorship. It is important to remember that public gatherings are totally prohibited in Cuba, so every individual who has joined these demonstrations has put their lives on the line. They have decided that it is worth it to risk jail time, beatings, torture, and even death if it means the Cuban people might finally have the chance to be free. We must not lose sight of just how powerful that is. The Cuban people are fed up. They have had enough of a repressive dictatorship. We must stand with them in their quest for freedom. I appreciate the statements of strong support we have seen so far from President Biden and Speaker Pelosi. I am ready to work with the Biden administration to translate those statements into actions we can take to provide immediate support to the Cuban people. We need to work urgently to restore and expand internet access on the island. Unfortunately, there is no silver bullet to solve this problem. The regime is effective at confiscating equipment needed for satellite connections, and it is adopting and improving its censorship tools with the technical support from the Chinese government. However, I believe we can still do much more to address this issue by working with private companies and civil society to expand internet access to help Cubans use the VPN and other circumvention tools. Another immediate step we should take is to identify and sanction perpetrators of human rights abuses under the Magnitsky Act. During the current crackdown on protesters, the Cuban state has carried out dozens of documented beatings on journalists and protesters and hundreds of arbitrary arrests. We also know of at least one killing at the hands of the state security, and we suspect there are others. I believe we should immediately sanction every single official who has committed these severe human rights violations. We should also expand our support for those protesting for Cuban civil rights society more broadly. I have long advocated for U.S. assistance to Cuban pro-democracy organizations. We should deepen that support at this critical moment. We must remember that there was a human rights crisis in Cuba before July 11th. There are already 150 political prisoners. There were already 150 political prisoners at the beginning of this month, and regime has increasingly targeted artists from the San Isidro movement. I call on our allies in Europe and Latin America to step up and work with us to promote human rights in Cuba. Now is also the time to finally put an end of the Cuban doctors program. This is a state-sponsored form of human trafficking whereby 50,000 Cubans have their passports confiscated, their movements restricted, and their wages garnished. The regime retaliates against their family members if they try to leave the program. We saw in Venezuela how the Cuban doctors were ordered not to provide life-saving medical treatment to people who were not loyal to the Maduro government. This is shameful. I am glad Secretary Blinken highlighted this horrific program when we launched the State Department's Trafficking in Persons report. The United Nations Special Rapporteur on contemporary forms of slavery and trafficking in persons have also denounced these forced labor programs. We need countries throughout the world to stand together in saying they will not work with the Cuban regime to exploit these doctors anymore. I will soon be introducing my legislation to address this important issue, and I urge my colleagues to support it. I will end on a personal note. I fled Cuba with my family when I was 11 years old. And I remember how the military came to my house and searched my house because they accused my father of hoarding merchandise. Luckily, somebody tipped off the family. We came from a very small town. And my father was able to take the merchandise and bury it in the backyard. So as the military pulled away, we're very fortunate somebody tipped us off. I also remember the military coming into my house as soon as we filed papers to leave and take inventory of every single item that we owned, from the house to the picture on the wall. And when we received our exit visa, they came back and checked off that every single item in that house was left behind to the Cuban government. 2 months later, they turned the house to a communist member, a party member in the town that my father built. It was not a big house. It was a very modest house. But still, you had to turn every single thing that you owned to the government before you could leave. I have not forgotten that. It is because of this repressive regime that I was never able to return to Cuba to see my grandmother before she died. I have spent every day since I left Cuba hoping it would one day become a democracy. I hope that this is the beginning of the end of the Castro and Diaz-Canel dictatorship. But what I know for sure is that the Cuban people have provided an inspiring example of courage, and they deserve our full support. Thank you, and I will now turn to the ranking member, Mark Green, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Sears, and thank you for sharing your personal story as well. Thanks for holding this hearing, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. I especially want to thank Ms. Rosa Maria Paya. Rosa Maria, we applaud your courage in the face of tyranny. The testimony we're about to hear from her is from a courageous individual whose family has been permanently scarred. On July 22nd, it will be 9 years since her father, Oswaldo Paya, and his colleague, Harold Sapiro, were extrajudicially killed by the Cuban regime. He was a brave man and regretfully joins the ranks of many others who've died at the hands of the regime and under suspicious circumstances. Last Sunday was a momentous and an inspirational day. Tens of thousands of Cubans all throughout the country took to the streets demanding freedom from the communist dictatorship. Some even waved the American flag as they demanded libertad. Since 1959, Cuban people have been trapped by the iron grip of Fidel Castro, his brother, and its hand-picked successor. Despite brutal and violent crackdowns from the regime, many courageous Cubans continue demanding their God-given right to liberty and democracy, something 3 generations and millions of Cubans have been deprived of. Let's be clear. This is not about COVID-19. This is not about the embargo. What are the Cuban people shouting in the streets? Libertad. Cubans are sick and tired of being oppressed, and they are in the streets openly and bravely demanding an end to communism. Even prior to these recent protests, anti-regime sentiment has steadily increased in the country. In November, the communist regime broke up a hunger strike led by the San Ysidro movement, a collective of artists, musicians, writers, and scholars. This led to a large protest by hundreds of artists and activists in front of the regime's Ministry of Culture. These protests have been dubbed by some observers as an awakening of civil society in Cuba, and it sure looks that way. A new generation is rising up, and they want to live in freedom. I am in awe of the courage of the Cuban people and the many risks they take protesting the violent and brutal dictatorship. We must not ignore the dangers they face. An untold number of peaceful protesters and activists remain imprisoned. Demonstrators risk jail, degrading treatment, torture, even death, all for liberty. Additionally, the communist regime uses Chinese technology to block and censor internet service and disrupt communications across the island. These violations of basic human rights are absolutely unacceptable. We must demand action. This is a crisis that requires a bipartisan response. And Chairman Cyrus, I know this issue hits home for you, and I know you hear, as no one else can, the Cuban people's cries for liberty and dignity. Holding the communist regime accountable for its repressive policies while supporting the people's quest for freedom and democracy is crucial. I hope we can prioritize this issue for the good of all Cubans and for the good of the Western Hemisphere at large. The Cuban people have never experienced the kind of self-government and freedom that many Americans take for granted. As the freest and most prosperous nation in the world, the United States must unequivocally stand with the Cuban people against the communist regime. There's a light at the end of the tunnel, and Cuba has never been closer. When will the Cuban people finally be free? When people of faith are no longer afraid of arbitrary detentions, threats, and harassment from communist officials, that is liberty. When artists, musicians, and writers can freely express their political opinions in song without fear of retaliation, that is liberty. When parents don't have to wait hours in line for basic staples like rice and beans just to feed their starving children, that is liberty. When the dying communist regime breathes its last breath, when a sovereign republic takes its place, and when separated families are reunited in a free Cuba, that is liberty. Mr. Chairman, the people of Cuba are looking to the United States for help and guidance. I look forward to working with you to answer their cries. Thank you, and I yield.
Thank you very much, Ranking Member Green. I will now yield to Ranking Member McCall for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Cyrus and Ranking Member Green, for your passionate remarks this morning and for holding this important hearing on historic protests that we are seeing in Cuba. I think this is a pivotal point in history. It's a moment in time, and we need to take advantage of it. Since last Sunday, tens of thousands of brave Cubans from all around the country have protested the communist dictatorship that has repressed them for over 60 years. And despite being met with brutal violence and censorship, they continue risking their lives to fight for freedom. And as freedom-loving Americans, we stand with them. The people of Cuba were promised communism would work. They were told to sacrifice their freedoms and ambitions in exchange for a utopia of equality and world-class health care. Instead, the 3 generations, over 60 years, have been doomed to misery and shortages as a result of this failed ideology. Brave Cubans have woken up to the lies and propaganda fed to them by Fidel Castro and his cronies. And the world must bear witness and recognize the significance of this historic time. And they are protesting the dictatorship, waving the greatest symbol of liberty, libertad, known to man, the American flag. Because they know, and the regime knows, that America stands for everything the Cubans are fighting for: freedom, liberty, and democracy. Regime thugs are snatching innocent Cubans from their homes simply for calling for freedom. And we know the Venezuelans are in there too, with their military, as they crack down, they knock doors down and take people out of their homes and throw them in prison. The idea that a protester will be sentenced to 20 years in prison for simply exercising what is sacred in this country, and it's a right to free speech. And they are violently cracking down and violating the religious freedoms and liberties of the Cuban people. They're also using Chinese technology to block and censor internet access from the island. And this committee will be working with technologies within the State Department to open up those lines of communication. We cannot let our adversaries take advantage of the situation and infiltrate our hemisphere. And the world is watching, and they're watching very closely what we do at this moment in time. These human rights violations cannot and will not go unpunished. Cubans deserve liberty and all that it entails, and we must do everything in our power to fight with them for their freedom. And that work begins in Congress, and it begins at the White House. I was proud to co-sponsor a bipartisan resolution with my colleagues stating our solidarity with the brave Cuban people. We must also make sure the administration is doing everything it can to provide uncensored internet access around the country. We need to work with the Biden administration to lead the international effort for Cuban freedom and freedom fighters, supporting the democracy leaders and activists on the island. Simply put, we have a moral obligation and a duty to support their aspirations. We need our democratic and freedom-loving allies around the world and peace-loving people around the world to stand with the people of Cuba to support them against this oppressive regime. I want to take this moment to commend our witness, Rosa Marie Paya, for her strength, for her advocacy. Almost 9 years ago, her father was murdered by the Cuban regime. And we are so sorry, Ms. Paya. And many others were too. And many sit in prison, rotting in jails because of this monster and his successors. He was internationally known Cuban dissident, your father, and to this day, his death has never been properly investigated. Your family, like many others who dare to speak to the truth, to power, has paid the ultimate price in your struggle for freedom. And I have to say, Ms. Paya, I admire your bravery. I want to thank you for being here today. What is happening in Cuba is all the proof we need that communism and socialism are bankrupted ideologies that can only lead to utter failure and human misery. So in closing, as Cubans continue to stand up and reject communism and the dictatorship that has doomed 3 generations of Cubans, let me just say we will stand with them as they bravely fight for freedom. Cuba Libre. I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member McCall. I will now introduce Mr. Jose Miguel Vivanco, who is a leading expert on human rights issues throughout Latin America and the Caribbean. He is an executive director of the Americas Division at Human Rights Watch. Mr. Vivanco previously worked as an attorney for the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights at the Organization of the American States. He is also the founder of the Center for Justice and International Law. Mr. Vivanco studied at the University of Chile and Salamanca Law School in Spain and holds a Master's of Laws degree from Harvard Law School. Mr. Vivanco, we welcome you to the hearing. We will then hear from Ms. Rosa Maria Payat. She is a widely recognized Cuban activist and a vocal advocate for freedom and human rights in Cuba. She serves as the director for Cuba Decide, an organization focused on restoring democracy and the rule of law to Cuba. She is the daughter of Osvaldo Payat, a well-known dissident who dedicated his life to the struggle for freedom in Cuba and who was killed at the hands of the regime in July 2012. Ms. Payat holds a degree in physics from the University of Havana. Ms. Payat, thank you for joining us today. I ask the witnesses to please limit your testimony to 5 minutes, and without objection, your prepared statements will be made part of the record. Mr. Vivanco, you are recognized for your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to testify today on this very, very important matter for human rights in the Western Hemisphere. This hearing couldn't be more timely. Since July 11th, thousands of Cubans have taken to the streets across the country in landmark demonstrations, protesting long-standing restrictions on rights, freedoms, scarcity of food and medicines, and the government's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. The Cuban government has reacted with brutal repression and censorship. Since the protests began, several organizations have reported countrywide internet block and restrictions on social media and messaging platforms. Cuban rights groups report that around 500 people have been detained. Human Rights Watch has conducted thousands of interviews to document the government's response to the protest. We have received credible reports of police beatings and documented multiple cases of arbitrary detention of protesters, activists, and journalists, including many who have been held incommunicado and some whose whereabouts remain unknown. People detained include members of the San Isidro and 27N movements, 2 coalitions of artists and journalists who have been facing a government crackdown. In recent months, Human Rights Watch has been continuously documenting abuses against them, including arbitrary detention and restrictions of movement and communications. Victims include people who have performed in or even simply played or promoted Motherland and Life, a song by Cuban artists that challenge the Cuban government's old slogan, Motherland or Death, Patria o Muerte, and criticize the repression in the country. We found consistent and repeated patterns in the abuses which strongly suggest a plan by the Cuban authorities to systematically repress these independent artists and journalists. Mr. Chair and members of the subcommittee, even as the Cuban government insists on its decades-old repression, Cuba is changing. Thousands of Cubans are overcoming their fear of the government, and despite the government's attempts to restrict communications, increase Increased access to the internet has enabled many to organize protests and reports on abuses in ways that were virtually impossible only a few years ago. At this critical juncture, we urge the United States Congress and the Biden administration to take the necessary steps to dismantle the embargo and abandon the ongoing policy of isolation, which has produced no improvements on human rights in the island. For too long, the U.S. embargo has provided the Cuban government with an excuse for its problems, a pretext for its abuses, and a way to garner sympathy abroad with governments that might otherwise have been willing to condemn the country's repressive practices more vocally. Rather than isolating Cuba, the policy has isolated the United States, impeding the multilateral and coordinated approach that is needed to press the Cuban government to end its repressive policies and practice. I urge the U.S. Congress and the Biden administration to take steps towards a new approach in Cuba, including, 1, progressively dismantling the policy of isolation towards Cuba. 2, collaborating with governments in Latin America and the European Union to ensure a multilateral and coordinated approach. 3, working with these governments to monitor and denounce restrictions on access to internet in Cuba. Cuba is changing, and it's past time the U.S. policy changes too. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Ms. Payat, I now turn to you for your testimony.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair, and thank you so much to all the members of the Congress for this opportunity and for your kind words. My name is Rosa Maria Payá from the Citizen Initiative Cuba Decide to promote human rights. Our network on the ground have seen explosive growth over the last 16 months. My father, Oswaldo Payá, was killed in Cuba under the orders of the Castro brothers on July 22, 2012. The Cuban peoples are in the streets fighting for freedom. In at least 45 cities, massive protests took place. This regime has responded with brutal repression, causing countless arrests, injuries, and death. On national TV, Miguel Díaz-Canel has called for a war in the streets and to fight using any means. In the eastern provinces, the police shot on one protester in the head. It is on video. The name of the victim is still unknown. Daniel Cárdenas was shot inside his home in the city of Cárdenas. His wife was present. It's on video. Diovis Laurencio was shot in the back and killed in La Habana. It's on video. He was 36 years old, and his family is now denouncing that official press falsely called him a delinquent. Videos show people arriving at hospitals badly hurt by police beatings and bullets. One shot in the arm, another in the leg, another in the stomach. The victims are workers and students, not only members of the organized opposition. FDP has documented at least 532 detained and missing persons, but we estimate that the actual number to be in the thousands. The regime has its days numbered, and the world is watching. In this context, to lift the sanctions against the Cuban regime is to fund the Cuban police and military, who oppress the people in the streets, obeying top government officials like General Raúl Castro, Miguel Díaz-Canel, General Rodríguez López Callejas, General Álvarez Casas, Minister of Interior, General López Miera, Minister of the Armed Forces. It is a moral imperative to stop the regime abuses after 62 years of crimes against humanity perpetrated by a military dictatorship that has never been held accountable. Despite the lack of food and medicines, the protesters are demanding freedom, human rights, and democracy. They were shouting, "No more fear, change is possible, and down with the dictatorship." None of them mentioned the US embargo, but instead, homeland and life, patria y vida, the alternative to the Castro's slogan of homeland and death. To accept the blackmail of the migratory crisis by the Cuban regime is to fail the Cuban people. we urge the U.S. government not to make unilateral concessions to the regime, but rather demand the release of all political prisoners, an end for the repression, and respect for our fundamental freedoms, including the legalization of all political parties. I would like to share 5 policy recommendations from the majority of the Cuban civil society on and off the island. We humbly ask to the U.S., please, the U.S. should apply individual sanctions, making full use of the Global Magnitsky Act, targeting top officials and individuals involved in human rights abuses. The U.S. should replicate its approach to the South African apartheid and require all companies in relation with Cuba to mandatorily embrace the Sullivan principles. The U.S. should take action to break the regime's communication monopoly by enabling independent access to Internet to Cubans, bypassing the censorship of the regime. The U.S. should invite the European Union and the Organization of the American States, all the members of the Organization of the American States, to take similar steps and use all available tools, including the Inter-American Treaty of Reciprocal Assistance, to address the threat posed by the Cuban regime. The regime is illegitimate and should continue to be excluded from the Summit of the Americas until it complies with the Inter-American Democratic Charter. The U.S. has the ability to stop the impunity of the regime and protect persons from its brutal repression. All options within the international law must be on the table to protect civilians' lives in Cuba. My father said that the American and the Cuban people queremos ser libres y amigos. We want to be free and we want to be friends. Thank you for this opportunity, and thank you to the American people.
Thank you very much. Before I begin questions, I ask unanimous consent that Representatives Debbie Wasserman Schultz, Val Demings, Nicole Miliotakis, and Scott Perry participate at today's hearing after all subcommittee members have had the opportunity to participate and question the witnesses. I will now begin questions by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. The State Department in 2021 Trafficking in Persons reports for Cuba maintained that Cuba as a Tier 3 country. In his remarks at the launch of the report, Secretary of State Anthony Blinken said that the regime has profited from its exploitive overseas medical missions. What are some of the conditions that Cuban doctors are subjected to as part of this medical mission? And what does the international community need to do to put an end to this exploitation? Mr. Vivanco?
Mr. Chair, the Cuban doctors deployed in different parts of the world provide a valuable service to many communities in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia, but at the expense of their most basic freedoms. That is the price. To the point that we believe that the use of these doctors amount to the practice of forced labor. The Cuban doctors are subject of draconian rules that violate the right to privacy, freedom of expression and association, liberty and movement, among several other freedoms that are restricted during their missions when, they're deployed in different communities and the Cuban government profit substantively with their service.
Do you have an estimation of how much they profit, how much it makes for the island?
It's quite difficult to get a number for lack of transparency. So there are different type of figures out there. However, we are looking into a very, very significant income for the government of Cuba.
And when these doctors are sent to these countries, they're sent by themselves. Families are left behind?
The families are left behind, and they even restrict access to the money that they are supposed to be making until the conclusion of the mission. In other words, their promised payment, which is 10 times or more what they will be able to earn in their practice as doctors in Cuba. That is the attraction, of course. But the way that the Cuban government pay them and their family is conditioned to their performance in their communities and to the conclusion of the full program, usually after 1 or 2 years.
And if they ask for asylum in the country that they're serving, what happens?
They lose the money that they are supposed to earn. That's why they pay at the end. They keep paying some small portions for them to be able to survive in the local, in the community, in the local country, as well as for the family to get some, stipend. But they might lose all the benefits, and their family are not going to be able to leave the country. The Cuban doctor, if it's lucky, might get some political asylum in that country, but isolated for who knows how long from their families.
Because he's never going to be able to bring the family to where he has asked for asylum.
It will be very, very difficult.
Thank you. During the protests, the Cuban government shut down internet access in entire areas of the island. I know you made some recommendations of what this country can do, but can you expand on that?
Yes, of course. Thank you so much. We have known that the United States, and for United States and also including private enterprises, are able or could have the capacity to provide internet access, satellite internet access, bypassing the censorship of the regime. In this moment, we ask the United States to move quickly and to enable the Cuban citizens with a way of communication that in this moment has the capacity of save lives.
Now, the reports are that over 50 cities, the people turned out. Was the internet shut off in all those cities?
Almost in all the island. Almost in all the
entire island?
Almost in the entire island. People start communicating using Wi-Fi spots through VPNs, but it was very, very difficult to get any access to communication.
Do you know the reaction of the EU to the shutting down of the internet and the people demonstrating on the island?
Well, there have been reactions from the European Parliament and from the European parliamentarians that have been very, very solidarious with the Cuban people, but I don't know of any response from the European External Action Service actually in the direction of supporting the Cuban people. Actually, they insist in maintaining a cooperation agreement that includes political dialogue that have been already violated by the Cuban regime, which human rights clause have been already violated.
My time is up. Thank you very much, Congressman Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Rosa Marie, we often hear that the United States embargo is the primary cause of the lack of prosperity and democracy on the island. We hear that Cuban entrepreneurs would succeed only if they could trade and engage with their American counterparts. In previous testimony, you informed Congress, and I quote, "There cannot be free markets where there are no free persons." Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, that's actually a phrase of my father, and thank you so much for your words about him. And I think that the best answer to your question is coming from the Cuban people in the streets. They were not asking for the end of the embargo. They were asking for the end of the dictatorship. At the end of the dictatorship is a demand of the Cuban people. That's the demand alone, and that's the demand that we need solidarity to.
So just to make sure I heard you correctly, the people that are in the streets protesting. They're not protesting an embargo. They're protesting the communist regime that's in charge and a dictatorship over their country.
They have been shouting, change is possible, down with the dictatorship, no more fear, freedom, freedom, freedom. I think that's eloquent enough.
It is. Thank you. It's interesting that small fringe elements of the left here are trying to say that it's the embargo. But truth be known, it really has nothing to do with the embargo. If you look at 90% of the companies in Cuba, they're held by military holding companies, meaning the Cuban military runs 90% of the economy in Cuba. Well, there's a law in the United States that says an American company cannot do business with a Cuban military. So if we lift the embargo, we can't even do business with them. And where does the money go if 90% of the companies are held by the Cuban military? Well, it just empowers the dictatorship. This insane notion that lifting the embargo is going to somehow provide freedom for the Cuban people is crazy. It's absurd. And the only reason you would say that is unless you're trying to hide behind socialism and communism as an effective model. But everywhere else it's been in the world, it's been disproved. Let's look at North Korea. They can't get rice. They're starving. Remember the USSR in Berlin? They built a wall to keep their people in. And socialism, look at Venezuela. It is not the embargo, Mr. Chairman, that is causing the people of Cuba to suffer under this totalitarian dictatorship, and lifting it will only empower them. Cuba's egregious religious freedom violations are well documented, and they are widespread. The U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom has called for global Magnitsky Act sanctions on the head of Cuba's Office of Religious Affairs, Cardio Diega, for her direct role in leading campaigns of repression against Cuba's religious communities. Can you both share examples of how the regime restricts and penalizes religion in policy and practice? Sir, if we could start with you.
The exercise of fundamental freedoms in Cuba depends on the degree of tolerance of the Cuban government. There is no rule of law in Cuba. There is a total concentration of power, no independent judiciary. The judiciary is under the subordination of the executive branch. If the government believes that is...
If I could interrupt you just a second. I think I understood you to say there's no rule of law, it's just total power concentrated in the hands of the dictatorship.
Exactly.
So how then, I'm going to flip back to my previous question, because you supported lifting this embargo. How then, if the total power is all in the hands of one individual, does lifting the embargo free the people? I don't understand.
Congressman Green, in foreign policy, you have multiple options. If you want to influence, if you want to have impact on the record of any given country, the option that you have chosen for over or close to 60 years is the isolation. That policy has brought no change in Cuba. I believe that
I would submit to you right now there's change happening. There are thousands of Cubans in the streets. There's a spotlight on the Cuban government. The world is crying for the internet to be open so we can see with transparency what's going on. We're at a point right now that may just be a great opportunity for two reasons. One, to show exactly what's going on in Cuba under this totalitarian dictatorship, happened because of the embargo. And two, to once again put another head of a communist dictator on the wall, and I mean that proverbially for all the people who are going to go out there and say Green is espousing some kind of violence. I am not. I am saying, but here's another failed communist regime. That's what I think. Two great opportunities. That system doesn't work, and we can free the Cuban people. And unfortunately, Mr. Chairman, I'm out of time. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman Green. Congressman Castro.
Thank you, Chairman. And thank you, Ranking Member, for organizing this hearing today. And before I address my questions to our witnesses, I want to reiterate my support, most of all, for the Cuban people. I continue to be moved by their plight for their freedoms and their fight for their freedoms, for COVID-19 assistance and an end to hunger in their nation. And I express my solidarity with them, especially with those brave Cubans who remain disappeared or been imprisoned for standing up for their human rights and for their families. And I join UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, in her call to the Cuban government to immediately release those arrested during the protests. I also think it's necessary for the United States to, as President Obama said during his visit to Havana, bury the last remnant of the Cold War in the Americas and pursue a Cuba policy that improves the lives of the Cuban people. And so I wanted to ask a few questions of our witnesses, or actually before I do that, I know there's a debate about the embargo and how much that's responsible versus the Cuban government and so forth. And most of all, we support the freedom of the Cuban people and their right to choose the leadership of their nation. As Americans, we want to be as helpful to that as possible. But in this debate about communism and socialism and so forth, our biggest trading partner, the United States, is a communist country, China. We have no embargo against China. That's our biggest trading partner. So I have a question to Ms. Vivanco. Thank you for your testimony today. And a question that remains after the mass protests across Cuba is what the United States government can do to best improve the lives of the people of Cuba. In his historic speech and diplomatic trip to Havana, President Obama discussed at length how the United States embargo and policy of isolation towards Cuba was not working, saying, quote, "The embargo is outdated and should be lifted." So, Mr. Vivanco, what is the current purpose of the U.S. embargo in Cuba, and how does it help or hurt the Cuban people?
Congressman Castro, thank you very much for your question. In my view, following human rights conditions in Cuba for over 30 years, my conclusion is that it's time for the U.S. to take a different approach. It's the only country in the world that enforces a policy of isolation. That policy is rejected unanimously for the rest of the world. Even conservative governments from Europe and Latin America has never agreed with the policy of the embargo because it imposed indiscriminate sanctions against the people of Cuba and has shown to be absolutely ineffective. If you want to bring change to Cuba and transition from dictatorship to democracy, you need to create a multilateral approach, a new type of approach to create the right kind of incentives and pressure for the Cuban to take those steps. Cuba is not isolated from the rest of the world. Tourists from Europe, Canada, or any country in Latin America could spend their money, they could invest in extractive industries in Cuba. The only one that is isolated from Cuba is the US. The only one that is isolated in this debate at global level on the Cuban affairs is the US. Why? Because the policy of isolation made the position of the US actually kind of impotent with regard to the debate on Cuba.
I also wanted to ask you about remittances, the ability for folks to send money to Cuba. You know, remittances are a vital lifeline to millions of Cubans, especially the most vulnerable, like the elderly, and are used to purchase basic necessities like sanitary items and food, and even obtaining access cards to have access to the internet. The Trump administration imposed restrictions on remittances and pushed the largest receiver of family remittances in Cuba, Western Union, to abandon operations on the island. Unfortunately, these harmful policies continue today. So I wanted to ask you, can you describe how remittances help the most vulnerable of Cubans to survive and obtain daily necessities?
It is absolutely essential to facilitate the use of remittances, the ability of Cuban families and friends to send money for their relatives to be able to survive in the country, to be able to buy the minutes, to use Wi-Fi and internet, which is available in Cuba, and is one of the vehicles that explain this mobilization in Cuba. I think is the right approach to reestablish the ability of Cuban families to send money to their relatives in Cuba.
Thank you. I yield back, Chairman.
Thank you, Congressman Castro. Representative Pfluger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to both of you for your testimony, Ms. Paya. Thank you for your personal story. For over 60 years, the Cuban people have been oppressed by the worst impulses of a brutal regime and failed promises of communist propaganda. And what we're seeing today is those people saying enough is enough. We must stand with them and finally rid the Western Hemisphere of this hegemon of oppression. And unfortunately, the Biden administration is sending very dangerous and mixed signals through both policy and rhetoric to those that wish to flee this brutal regime. That if you're fleeing a communist regime where defectors are silenced or shot and everyday citizens are starving to death, you're not welcome in America. This is the message that Secretary Mayorkas, who himself was born in Havana, gave last week when he remarked that Cuban refugees attempting to flee by the sea will not be permitted in the United States. This message is echoed again by Acting Assistant Secretary at the State Department when he remarked that the protests were peaceful and rooted only in concerns about rising COVID cases and medicine shortages. This is false. The Cuban people, as you've mentioned, are shouting Libertad. They're waving the American flag. They're standing for freedom. They're not shouting down with an embargo. And while our administration downplays the severity of the crisis in Cuba and pledges to turn away Cuban refugees, President Biden has simultaneously thrown open the southern borders to cartels, coyotes, and others. Meanwhile, the administration advocating for socialist policies right here in the United States, when we see massive government control over society, simply does not work. Cuba is showing us in real time and the world how quickly communism collapses and leads to a spiral of deadly conditions of poverty, starvation, and hopelessness, causing enough desperation that right now Cubans are staring down the oppressors in the streets and risking their lives to cross treacherous waters on homemade rafts to reach the shores of liberty, the symbol of freedom, the United States of America. And the United States remains the beacon of freedom and democracy around the world, and we must do everything within our power to support those who are valiantly standing for liberty, and we must do it right here at home. There have been a chorus of this very body right here in Congress supporting the Cuban people in their efforts, and I certainly support that effort as well. And instead of throwing our doors open to human traffickers on our southern border, President Biden must take decisive action to bolster the pro-democracy movement and support the brave Cubans who are fighting in their own streets for liberty. Ms. Paya, how important is it to have freedom of speech? What does it mean to have freedom of speech?
Thank you so much. It is fundamental, and it's the root of what is going on in Cuba. The people of Cuba haven't waited for the Cuban regime to authorize them to speak. They are shouting freedom in the streets. And if I make a call, a request for all of you, is to please to listen to what the Cuban people is demanding at the street, at the highest possible risk, which is life. They are demanding freedom. They are demanding the end of the dictatorship. Please, do not politicize that. It's not about politics. It's not about right and left. It's about the main and contradiction that the Cubans have experienced, which is not the embargo or any other contradiction between the military dictatorship and any other country. It's the main contradiction. The root of the suffering of the Cuban people is the conflict between a group of militaries that have held power in a legitimate way for more than 62 years and a whole population that is demanding a change, that is demanding a transition process, that is demanding democracy, and that now the United States and the rest of the world have the opportunity and the challenge to take sides with the Cuban people to help the Cuban people to hold accountable that regime and to bring about freedom in Cuba. That also means democratic stability and also means getting rid of one of the threats that the national security of this country has in this hemisphere.
Thank you for that. And I just want to go back to one of the remarks that you made, that you said that lifting sanctions is basically funding terrorism. It's funding the dictatorship to do what they want through military action. And I appreciate your comments on that. And Mr. Chairman, I know I'm out of time. Thank you again for holding this hearing. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Congressman Andy Levin, you're on.
Thanks so much to the chairman and ranking member for holding this really important hearing this morning. You know, one of the subjects of the protests has been access to COVID vaccines. In my view, this is an area where the U.S. might be able to actually heed the Cuban people's call. But it's my understanding that sending vaccines to Cuba would require a special license, at least from the Department of Commerce and perhaps also Treasury. Last week, Ricardo Herrero, executive director of the Cuba Study Group, tweeted, "Everyone trying right now to coordinate aid to the Cuban people is running into a morass of OFAC and commerce, shipping and banking restrictions. This is how current U.S. policy doesn't help." Mr. Vivanco, do you believe that current sanctions and the current sanctions regime makes the delivery of humanitarian aid to the Cuban people more difficult?
Indeed. I believe that the measures that the Biden administration and this Congress could take to facilitate access to medicine and vaccine even, to alleviate these painful times of the Cuban people who have no access to vaccine. I believe also that the Cuban government has been reluctant to accept vaccines from Russia and China for dogmatic reasons. They were hoping to develop their own vaccine.
Right.
And if the U.S. government could help and provide some relief for the Cuban people with access to vaccine, I think will be terrific.
And it would really have a big impact on our relationship directly with the people, right?
Exactly.
Yes, and you know, given the crackdowns that we've seen on the protesters, horrible crackdowns, it seems that the kind of sanctions that we're talking about here, the kinds that are not targeted, have not prompted the government to improve its human rights record. Would you agree?
I agree 100%.
So tell us, in your view, what do you think the best approach would be for us to influence the Cuban government on its human rights record, something you've devoted your career to, including the crackdowns on protesters? If we want to get away from ideology and talking points and actually help improve the human rights record there, what should we do?
Actually, Congressman Levin, I do believe that the best way to support the dictatorship is keep the status quo. In other words, change nothing. Insist on a policy that has failed, the policy of isolation, the policy of sanctions, has bring no improvement on human rights in Cuba. My sense is that the U.S. foreign policy toward Cuba is not inspired on the need to improve human rights and democracy in Cuba. It's just a policy that reflects the preferences of the electorate in Florida and has nothing to do with the goal to improve human rights in Cuba.
So, but do you think there are things we can do, and what are they? Because I'm with you, I agree with you, but what should we do?
What you should, try to do, especially now that you have the majority in the House, is to take the necessary steps to at least open up a debate about the lack of effectiveness of a policy of isolation toward Cuba. and to empirically established whether there is any other democracy in the world that has been willing to join forces with the U.S. in the policy of isolation. You will conclude that the rest of the world every year systematically condemn that policy. And only Israel and the U.S. support a policy of isolation on Cuba. So if you could take internal steps to at least open up a debate about the lack of effectiveness, the impotence of the U.S. government in affecting Cuban human rights conditions in Cuba, I think that would be very, very helpful.
Well, thanks. You know, obviously there's strong policy disagreements on this subject, but I think we all agree on our commitment to the Cuban people and their well-being. And I hope that in the interest of that commitment, we're able to have a nuanced and honest conversation about what policies are helpful and which are harmful. And you're making a very strong case that we've been beating our heads against the wall for 60 years, not helping the human rights situation in Cuba. So we really have to find a more effective way. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Congressman. Congresswoman Salazar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Jose Miguel Vivanco, for being here, and Rosa Maria Payá, and your family paid the highest sacrifice. Your father, Osvaldo Payá, stood up for a free Cuba. That is something that the Castro regime fears. They killed him, and they covered it up, saying that it was a car crash so that we will never know the truth. I met him twice when I was a news reporter, and he was the epitome of decency. I can say that. And I'm glad that you're here today because of your bravery and your commitment to his memory. After a week of silence, now the Biden administration is saying they're going to review the effect of the remittances. That is very embarrassing. It's a slap in the face to you, to your father, to all the Cuban people, and to us, the elected officials, who were not informed or consulted. The people of Cuba, as we have said, they are not shouting, abajo el embargo, no more, we want more remittances. They're shouting libertad. The bare minimum the Biden administration could do is to connect the internet, because that way the world will be able to know and see the truth, and they can communicate among themselves. They will also know that they are not alone and that the United States is with them. The Biden administration could enhance the Wi-Fi from Havana Embassy or from Guantanamo, and this can be done in minutes. Also, the private sector has developed these balloons that can carry Wi-Fi directly to the island. I'm going to say this message in Spanish. Directamente al pueblo cubano, vamos a hacer historia en el Congreso Federal de los Estados Unidos y hablarle directamente a los cubanos en español. Muchas gracias a ustedes por estar aquí. Tu padre Osvaldo Payá lo sacrificó todo. Luchó por la libertad de Cuba y eso es lo que el régimen teme. Lo asesinaron y falsificaron las evidencias diciendo que fue un accidente de carro para que no sepamos la verdad. Pero estamos aquí hoy gracias por tu valentía y en honor a la verdad. La administración de Biden dice que va a revisar el efecto de las remesas. Esto es un insulto para los cubanos y para nosotros los servidores públicos electos por el pueblo. El pueblo de Cuba no está gritando abajo el embargo, queremos más remesas o más vacunas. Lo que está gritando es queremos libertad. Vamos a hablar de soluciones reales. La mínima, la inmediata, puede ser conectar el Internet, que es la única manera de mostrar la verdad, que se puedan comunicar entre ellos. Y si saben que los Estados Unidos están con el pueblo cubano, millones acudirán a las calles a pedir libertad y el régimen no puede aguantar eso. La administración de Biden puede amplificar el Wi-Fi en la embajada en La Habana y en Guantánamo en cuestión de minutos. El sector privado ha desarrollado la tecnología para proveer esto. La pregunta es, ¿dónde está la Casa Blanca? Now my question is, I'm going to, if I have more time, I'm going to ask you questions, but I would like to talk to Mr. Vivanco and ask you a simple question. I was a news reporter and I saw when Obama lifted all restrictions. For 2.5 years, he gave the opportunity to the Cuban government to really join the international community, and they spit on Obama. 2 years. Dozens of American companies wanted to do business in Cuba, and the Castros did not allow them. Madonna went to celebrate her birthday, and while the Damas de Blanco were being beaten on the streets. Mick Jagger went to do a big concert. I interviewed dozens of American companies who wanted to do business with the Cuban government, and during the Obama years, the Cubans said, no, I don't know, let me see, because they are in the business of power. So when you are telling me, Mr. Vivanco, and you have a fantastic organization that you represent looking out for human rights, when you tell me the embargo is the solution, Obama proved it, and they spit on him, which was lamentable. So why do we have to lift the embargo? Please.
I never say that the embargo is the solution. I say that the embargo is the problem, it's not the solution. And if you want to
What do you mean by that?
Well, because, you know, and secondly, Congresswoman Salazar, the part of the problem is the perception, the notion that that there is some sort of quid pro quo relationship with the Cuban government. The Cuban government, I don't think, is interested in lifting the embargo. I think the embargo helped the Cuban government to keep that notion, that narrative that they are victims of the U.S. government.
But if the United States wants to do business and the American companies want to do business in Cuba, if the tyranny doesn't let them, it doesn't matter if there is an embargo or not. They just simply cannot go, Home Depot or Sheraton.
What you need is to create the conditions for the international community, for the rest of democracies in the world.
Obama created it, sir, or didn't he?
Right, no, but what you need is to create the conditions for democracies in Latin America and Europe to join support for human rights in Cuba. They are not crossing that line because the policy of isolation that they
Sir,
refuse,
Obama lifted the policy of isolation for 2.5 years, and the Castro regime did not respond.
I don't think
They gave
Obama,
everything in exchange of nothing. Let's look at the empirical evidence. Obama allowed for any American company to go and invest in Cuba, whether it was construction, hotel, hospitality, and the Cubans did not sign the contract.
Right, but
there was a ferry. I remember I was there, I was a news reporter, a ferry that wanted to go from Key West to Havana. The Cubans never allowed it. So what are you, I just would like to understand your position so maybe I can support it, but I don't see it because history proved it already with President Obama. So now if you lift the embargo, what's going to happen is the Chinese model. And the Chinese model is the worst thing that could happen to the Cubans.
Thank you, Congresswoman. In the second round, you'll be able to continue your questioning.
Thank you, sorry.
Debbie Wasserman-Schultz is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the gentleman for his indulgence in waiving on, allowing us to waive on to the committee. I had a chance to watch the subcommittee proceedings remotely. There's a couple of things I think it's important to point out. First is that President Biden has proposed additional sanctions and left the sanctions from the previous administration in place. He's declared himself, in his own voice, Cuba as a failed state. He gave voice to the Cuban protesters, issuing a clarion call for freedom. And he has stood solidly since the protests broke out and before that in support of a free Cuba. I also think, and Ms. Pava, I really want to agree with you about how important it is that this issue be nonpartisan, not bipartisan, but nonpartisan. So you'll forgive me if I defend a few things prior to going back to what should be a nonpartisan issue. I really think the audacity of those in the Republican Party who widely across this country support voter suppression and have supported the suppression and thrown obstacles in the path of people across this country who simply want to cast their lawful and constitutional right to vote, and who have denied that January 6th was an insurrection, have a lot of nerve suggesting that they are the champions of freedom in another country when they are engaging in suppression of the people's right to vote and freedom here. Okay, so setting aside that partisan, moment for a second, I want to ask Ms. Paya if you could talk with me about the Afro-Cuban environment, which I think is so underreported and so few people are aware of. According to the University of Pennsylvania's Professor Amalia Dache, almost 70% of the Cuban population is of African descent. Let that sink in for a moment. The State Department's 2020 Human Rights Report suggests that Cubans of African descent suffer significant racial discrimination, including subjection to racial slurs and beatings by security agents in response to the political activity. Many have also reported employment discrimination, particularly for positions of prominence within the tourism industry, media, and government. Despite this, Afro-Cubans have historically been at the forefront of the fight for Cuba's democracy and freedom, even though there has been a significant erasure of Afro-Cubans from history. Can you share with us the specific challenges or threats that Afro-Cuban activists face on the island, and how has the economic crisis in Cuba and the COVID-19 pandemic disproportionately affected Afro-Cubans?
Yeah. Thank you so much for that question, because actually Afro-Cubans are also the largest population in jail, are also the largest population with access, with families that comes from situations of vulnerability, and are also within the Cuban opposition, the Cuban civil society. We have seen it with all the actions that Movimiento San Isidro has made, have been also one of the most affected and targeted by the Cuban regime. It was already a challenge 1 week ago to be of African descent and walk by the streets of Havana without actually being asked for the ID, to check if actually he was a Havanian or he needed to be deported to the eastern provinces. That's what Cubans of African descent actually endure in our country, and I think it's a very important and relevant point, because it's widely ignored or not commented on about the racism of the character of this communist regime that have been using its propaganda as a machinery actually to get to human rights defenders around the world when they are actually trying to suppress those rights.
May I just interrupt you for a moment and just ask you to confirm, while the Cuba regime has declared racism ended, after the revolution, isn't it true that they have completely banned and prohibited any African or Black activism organization from existing and functioning on the island?
They have prohibited any independent organization asking for rights of Cubans of African descent. Yes, that's absolutely true.
Thank you. Thank you for the...
Of course, they have entitled themselves as the defenders of those rights.
Right, the irony. Mr. Chairman, thank you for your indulgence, and I just also want to point out that I myself have been a long-time opponent of lifting the embargo. I yield back the balance of my time, which I no longer have.
Thank you, Congresswoman. Congressman Perry, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, with all due respect, I'm UC'd in here as far as I know, and I appreciate it, but I think the good representative from New York should be next. And
It goes by seniority.
I'm happy to defer.
You're older.
No, I can go. I can go.
You want to defer to her?
Yeah, I think it'd be appropriate.
Yeah, but before her, I had Demings. Now, why don't you just go, and we'll take care of this. No, Congressman Perry.
All right. Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Well, I appreciate the opportunity to speak before this subcommittee regarding what I think is the evil dictatorial regime of the Cuban Communist Party. And I'll be clear about that. Before I continue, I want to pay tribute to one of our witnesses here today, Rosa Maria Paya, and thank you for all the work that you've done to give the Cuban people a democratic voice. I know I speak for everyone on this committee in condemning the despicable murder of your father, Oswaldo, at the hands of the Castro regime nearly 9 years ago on July 22nd. It is long past time for an independent investigation to be commissioned into Mr. Paya's death. You have our word and our commitment that we will do everything we can to bring this grotesque regime to account for its numerous crimes against humanity. Those who have lived through the evils of the Cuban regime could tell us with little regard the Castros have for the dignity and the worth of every human life. And we know that they sadistically tore apart families imprisoned and killed thousands of political dissidents, supported groups like the FARC and Sendero Luminoso, who decapitated people live on television and destroyed Cuba's economy. I recall November 2016 when the far-left apologists like Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau insisted that Cuba under Castro was actually a progressive, egalitarian utopia. I could only shake my head at the stomach-churning ignorance of a prominent head of state. This is unacceptable at any level, at every level. What most folks don't know is that compared with the average monthly income of approximately $20 for a Cuban citizen, Fidel Castro boasted a $900 million net worth in 2006, $900 million. Egalitarian is certainly not a word I would use to describe Cuba under Castro. Castro also sent doctors abroad on so-called humanitarian missions to bolster his own finances, all while the hospitals in Cuba remained chronically undersupplied and even lacked such basic products as aspirin and blankets. The Castros are both self-serving tyrants, and their puppet successor, Mr. Diaz-Canel, is cut from the same oppressive communist cloth. You'll hear from apologists that excessively long wait times at Cuban hospitals, food and medicine shortages, and lack of economic opportunity is entirely the fault of the American embargo. Couldn't be further from the truth. The embargo is the only reason Cuba isn't thriving economically, they'll say. What these apologists won't tell you is that Cuba trades extensively with almost every country in the rest of the world. The U.S. embargo doesn't prevent Cuba from trading with other countries or non-American companies. Indeed, Cuba trades extensively with China, Spain, Venezuela, and Russia. Gross mismanagement and dictatorial policies are to blame for Cuba's current state, not the embargo. And in true fashion, it is the little people in Cuba, it is the average citizen that suffers under socialism, under communism, under this dictatorship, and it is the people at the top that thrive. And just as an aside, that's what some of the people in this government in the United States of America want to bring to America. Today, we are thankfully able to bear witness to the tenacity and character of the Cuban people as they rise up to tell their evil government that they've had enough. Freedom has been subverted for generations in Cuba, but not for one day longer if the Cuban people have anything to say about it. I wish to iterate a word of caution to my colleagues. We must not undermine the efforts of Cuba's pro-democracy, anti-socialist movement. While the Cuban people languished under the progressive Castro regime, former President Obama re-engaged the wet foot, dry foot policy for the Cuban people in retaliation for Cuban Americans voting overwhelmingly Republican in the 2016 election. We can only hope that President Biden eschews such atrocious and blatantly obvious political retribution and instead commits the full resources of the United States government to benefit those yearning to be freed from tyranny 90 miles away from our shores. Now, Ms. Paya, can you tell us how Internet access would bolster the pro-democracy movement in Cuba right now and what America can do right now to make sure that happens?
Thank you so much. Actually, it has already done that. The very censored and scarce Internet access existing in Cuba has already given empowerment to the Cuban people, and now there are more Cubans that actually know. In 3 hours, that last Sunday, just in 3 hours, the protest replicated around the whole island. 3 hours after, there was no internet at all in the island, or it was almost cut it completely. So yes, to give internet access, satellite internet access with the capacity of bypassing the censorship or just being out of control of the Cuban regime has the possibility now also to save lives, because we are going to be able to, for instance, verify all the atrocities that we haven't been able actually to put in numbers and to put in the reports to the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights or to the UN, because we have no communication, we have no connections, and that connection and that freedom of speech that we were just talking previously is the only tool that the Cuban people have right now, that and their own bodies. And they are putting those bodies on the streets, and they are demanding freedom and the end of the dictatorship. If I may, I want to mention that last year We collect 45 tons of food and medicine as humanitarian aid, and we sent it to the island without any obstacle from the American government or institution. The only obstacle was the Cuban regime that confiscated all that humanitarian aid, and actually they just stole it.
Thank you.
I thank the chair and the ranking member, total committee's indulgence.
Congressman Demings, Congresswoman, apologies.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to you and the ranking member for allowing me to participate in today's very important hearing. The testimony and responses to our questions have been powerful, and I believe they are so necessary to our understanding of the dictatorial, communist, and socialist regime in Cuba. On July 11th and since, Cubans have bravely told us what they want for their future, and that's freedom. Let's be clear about that. We as a nation know, or we should know, that people are willing to sacrifice everything, to be beaten, to be in prison, to even die for the sweet taste of freedom. And we as a nation have another opportunity, yet another opportunity to get this right. And I am hoping that we will stay focused on freedom and not the destructive politics of the day. I too am specifically interested, first of all, on the unique challenges that Afro-Cubans face. My colleague did ask about that, but Mr. Vivanco, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the unique and specific challenges that Afro-Cubans face.
Yes, the Afro-Cuban community is large in Cuba and has been historically discriminated in spite of the official line that Cuba is not, it's a racial democracy. It's not, we know that it's not a democracy. We know that it's a dictatorship. And we know that they discriminate against those ones who comes from the Afro-Cuban community. And you see that one, as Rosa Maria Paya said, on the streets, in control, police control, and as well as in the prisons, in the Cuban prisons. Cubans' access to Afro-Cuban access to education, and as well as the top positions within the dictatorship.
Thank you so much. And I'd also like to ask about Cuban LGBTQ right activists who were arrested and beaten by plainclothes security officers in May of 2019 for organizing an unauthorized demonstration after government officials had canceled a planned annual march against homophobia. How would you evaluate current legal protections for LGBTQ individuals in Cuba and the level of societal discrimination against them as well?
As my colleague Rosa Maria Paya said, everything depends on Cuba and whether you are independent or you are part of the official machinery. So an LGBTQ organization that try to develop their own approach, their own policies, and they try to make an effort to, for instance, to monitor human rights conditions for their own community, are not allowed, are prohibited, and are subject of all sort of sanctions and persecution in Cuba, and unless you are part of the official structure.
Ms. Paya, anything you'd like to add there?
Yeah, I think it was very, very well established and accurate. And if I just ask, there are many members of the LGBT community, many Cubans of African descent within the opposition movement and the Cuban civil society. We Cubans, we understand that all of us, we need the fundamental human rights. But I need to say that those that are members of the LGBT community or that are Cubans of African descent have an extra challenge when they have to face the repression of the Cuban state security. And just briefly mention the case of Hector Luis Valdez Cocho. Actually, he's a Cuban of African descent, and he's a member of LGBT community, and he was almost raped during an arbitrary detention a few days ago.
Correct.
Thank you both so very much for your testimony. Mr. Chairman, I do yield back.
Thank you for participating. Congresswoman Nicole Malliotakis.
Thank you, Chairman. Despite my Greek last name, many of you may not know that I'm of Cuban descent. My mom is a Cuban refugee. My grandfather had his gas stations and small business home taken away from him by this regime. I still have family that are living there, and I could just say that this, because I've heard one of my colleagues earlier talk about COVID vaccinations. That is the least of their problems, okay? Nobody needs COVID vaccinations. They need them, perhaps, but it's not the issue, and that is not what they're fighting for. They want freedom. They are starving. They need access to medicine. They don't have any of these things because the regime takes it all. And with regards to the embargo, you know, I very much disagree with you, Mr. Vivenco, because Cuba does business with nearly every other country in the world, at least $100 billion in trade annually for that small island. The regime takes everything. The regime takes everything. Anything that comes into this island, whether it's money, whether it's food, whether it's medicine, the regime takes it. And lifting the embargo will do nothing except prop this communist regime, this murderous, brutal communist regime, which you understand as someone who is an advocate for human rights, further up. And it will do nothing to actually help the people. And so my question is first to someone who truly understands, as a dissident herself, Ms. Paya. Can you please explain to my colleagues how this regime weaponizes anything that comes into this island against their own people?
Yes, thank you so much for that question, because one of the things that the regime weaponized are actually human beings, Cubans. And I think that everybody here already understands that the Cuban regime can be thinking on blackmailing the United States with a migratory crisis. To get into that trap in this moment is to fail the Cuban people. The root of the problem is that dictatorship, and the Cuban people understand that, and that's why they are demanding the end of the dictatorship. Regarding all the things that are sent to the island, I have to say, we want to send everything to the island, but under the condition of no interference of the Cuban regime. And that condition is just because when the regime interferes, that sends hard currency or humanitarian assistance or whatever it is doesn't end in the hands of the Cuban people, but in the hands of the repressors. So it's very important that this country help us not to give money to the repressors, but to help the Cuban people. If I may, to make this discussion about the embargo is to take the old approach. The Cuban people is in the streets. Something changed in July 11, a week ago. The people is in the whole island demanding freedom, demanding the end of the dictatorship. And there are many sins, many new sins, many fresh sins that this administration, that the members of the OAS, that the European Union could do and should do to help that people. And I will repeat, please, targeted individual sanctions, rise the cost of the repression, targeting the individuals, the generals that are commanding those killings and those detentions. Replicate the South African experience when we say, please, put consequences to the enterprises that actually enrich the regime. We're not asking for any extraordinary. We're asking for the Sullivan principles, the same experience that actually work to end the apartheid. Why we cannot have that in Cuba now when the Cuban people is demanding that?
Thank you very much. So yes, the communist regime, if you are one of them, one of the communists, if you join their communist revolution, then you will be taken care of somewhat by what's coming into this island. If you are someone who is a dissident or just an average Cuban, you get absolutely nothing. That is the false promise of communism, that everything would be equal, right? That's what socialism claims. We want equality, yet it couldn't be further from the truth. The communists, dictators, the ruling class live like kings, and everyone else lives in squalor, and that is what we're trying to the end, and by pushing for freedom on this island and allowing them to determine their own future. Mr. Vivanco, I will, though, ask you a question, because as someone who is involved in the Human Rights Watch, I would love to know your opinion about Cuba, along with China and Russia and Venezuela, the most egregious human rights violators, being members of the United Nations Human Rights Council.
Do I have a second to answer your question?
Sure.
Look, a couple of points. I'm not in disagreement with you on the first point that when you mentioned that Cuba is not isolated. I fully agree with you. That is precisely the problem. You have failed to persuade the rest of the international community that you have to isolate Cuba. Cuba is not isolated. It's trading with, with any other country, including Brazil. Brazil is the most important source of food for Cuba. And so the trouble is that you are insisting on a policy that creates fundamental disagreement for the rest of the international community. And the challenge for me is to create conditions to bring in those democracies to exercise pressure on the Cuban government. But the line of the isolation and the embargo is not supported by the rest of the world. That is essentially the problem that you have here. It's a pragmatic problem. You need to look at this one with different eyes to see what will be the most effective policy from the US to improve human rights conditions, to force that dictatorship to transit from dictatorship to democracy. And certainly the approach that, that the US has taken for 60 years is not working. That is my point.
And we're doing business with everybody in the
Thank
world, and it's not working. But if you just answer my human rights,
we're going to have
question.
second round. Thank you very much. I'm going to ask a second round of question, if you don't mind. And I'll start by saying this. I am so happy that Congresswoman Demings raised the Afro-Cuban situation in Cuba, because for many years, the propaganda machine in Cuba has told the world how in Cuba there is no racism, that the Afro-Cuban is equal to the white Cubans. I mean, this propaganda machine, it's incredible throughout the world, because I have traveled extensively, and people tell me, I said, that's not accurate. Just like they have 5 vaccines in Cuba. Well, why don't they use them? Just like when they said they discovered oil off the island of Cuba. Well, how many barrels have they extracted? It made the whole east coast of this country in a panic, thinking that they were going to have drilling 90 miles from. So the propaganda machine in Cuba, it's the best in the world. So I'm so happy that you touched upon that point, that is a lie about how equal the society in Cuba is. And as far as the vaccine, I am all for sending vaccines to Cuba. My problem is that what you're going to have is the same situation you had in Venezuela. We sent vaccines to Venezuela, and the government takes it. So it doesn't get to the people. It just gets to the people who support this dictatorship. So how do you get around that, Mr. Vivanco? How do you get around the government taking everything you send to the island to help ease the situation on the island, when the government is just a taker?
Mr. Chair, the best vehicle to address that challenge is to do it through United Nations. United Nations, when they come into humanitarian crisis, like the one facing in Venezuela, one of the fundamental preconditions is that the distribution, access, and administration of all the food or medicine is done under the UN flag, not the local one, because it's obviously the temptation for the dictatorship in Venezuela, as well as in Cuba, is to take advantage of that one and to, to take advantage to do some more propaganda by using that type of support. So I don't see a way that the U.S. government, even the Biden administration, could provide access to or support for vaccination of the Cuban people without doing through some sort of vehicle like the UN, who has the capacity and the know-how to make those distributions according to UN principles, which are by definition, non-political.
In terms of the 5 vaccines that the Cuban claims they have, the Abdala and the other ones vaccines, why don't they use it?
The part of the problem is that the way that they have handled the COVID epidemic in Cuba has been a disaster. As I said before, our information revealed that they have rejected vaccines coming from China and Russia, just because they want to prove and to demonstrate to their own people and the rest of the world that they have the capacity to produce their own vaccine and then distribute that one to the rest of the world. Well, all of that, plan has failed, and it's part of another piece of Cuban propaganda.
Would you like to add something to that?
Yeah, just add that actually the Cuban regime also rejected the COVAX help. COVAX is an initiative of UN, or in relation with UN, and they also rejected the COVAX vaccine in a very criminal decision not to immunize the Cuban population and provoke an even deeper crisis than the one that we were already facing. Whether it is United Nations or the European Union or any other multilateral organization, the key thing is the no intervention of the Cuban regime. As soon as they participate in the process, they are going to stall the help, or they are going to weaponize that help against the Cuban people.
Thank you. Congressman Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the witnesses for willing to do a second round. One of my colleagues earlier commented that China was a good example where the U.S. has no embargo, and inferred that because of that, it's proof and reason why we should lift the embargo with Cuba. I'd encourage those who are supporting lifting the embargo and citing China as proof to go and watch the video of the protesters in Hong Kong. Go ask the Uyghurs what it's like to live in China under the Communist Party of China. I'd like to ask you to go and talk to the churches in China where they're forcing them to take the cross down and replace it with pictures of Xi Jinping. The only other place in the world I can recall in my limited travels as a military officer and in running a not-for-profit is that where the president's picture is so ubiquitous is Saddam Hussein in Iraq. Go ask the Falun Gong folks what it's like to have your organs forcibly removed and sold. I don't see the lifting of the embargo making a huge change there in China. Ask the student or the researcher, how easy is it to search the internet in China? They don't call it the Great Firewall of China for nothing. So this notion that, lifting the embargo is going to make totalitarian dictatorships change overnight is just, it pales. I'm an ER physician, not a brain surgeon, so perhaps, maybe there's something I don't know, but I'm sitting here thinking, totalitarian dictators in the past, how many of them with open economic have actually stepped down from power and allowed for a republic to develop? I can't think of one in history. Question for Ms. Paya. There's strong international consensus for restoring Venezuela's democracy. People are working together. Countries are supporting us in our, actions there. Yet in Cuba, as Mr. Vivanco, am I pronouncing? Yep. Has said they are doing in Cuba. We haven't gotten others to join us there. What is the difference? And this is just a genuine question. What is the difference, and why are they not helping with Cuba, but they seem to be very helpful with Venezuela and the socialist dictator down there?
Well, I think that's a question for the rest of the world, because what it is a reality is that tolerating 62 years of a communist dictatorship in the island of Cuba doesn't only affected several generations in my country, but has gravely and seriously affected the democratic stability of the whole continent. Actually, we wouldn't be talking about the collapse of the democracy in Venezuela without the support, the coordination, and the interference of the Cuban regime. Same thing with the repression in Nicaragua, and you know history. You know about the interference programs of the Cuban G2, well trained by the Stasi and the KGB in Latin America. So this in this pivotal moment that we are living as a nation that lives inside but also outside the island because of that dictatorship, our call for the international community is please see directly to the Cuban people, to the suffering of the Cuban people, and to the demand of the Cuban people. And that demand is freedom, and that demand is the end of the dictatorship, and that demand is not only going to help Cuba, but it's going to help peace and national security of our whole hemisphere.
Throughout the region, absolutely. It seems to boggle the mind that the world will join us to jump on Venezuela, but the folks that are actually, the Cuban military is in Venezuela. The Cuban military is helping Nicaragua.
Yes.
It just makes no sense to me that the rest of the world has joined us in this fight, and yet that seems to be the reason why it's failed, because we haven't gotten all the rest of the world involved, so let's just lift the sanctions. Makes no sense to me. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman Green. Congressman Vargas, thank you for coming.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much, and thank you for allowing me to be here. I apologize. I had a committee running at the same time as this one. The only thing I would correct for the record, maybe that Dr. Green said, I'm not sure that an ER physician would yield to a brain surgeon in every instance, maybe in this case. But
point taken.
But that being said, I have great concern for what's going on, obviously, in Cuba. I'd like to see the dictatorship gone, the authoritarian rule, and obviously have democracy and have people have the opportunity to vote and to choose whomever they want. That they haven't had that opportunity. I'd like to see the Cuban people be able to lift their standard of living. Obviously, Cuban Americans, when they come to the United States, they do very, very well, and I'm sure that that country would be able to lift up its standard of living if it had freedom, if it had democracy. But a lot of people ask, in a practical sense, what can we do to really help? Other short of sending the Marines, how, in a practical sense, can we help Cuba in this moment? Why don't I begin with you, Mr. Rivanco?
What we need is the support of the rest of the international community. Bringing change on Cuba and improving the record of Cuba on human rights and democracy without the support of Western democracies, European democracies, Canada, Latin American democracies, is going to be difficult. Has been very, very difficult. And normally when you raise questions about Cuba, to a head of a state in any Western democracy, they will ask you, what about the embargo? That is the problem. It becomes a distraction. And they say, you know, we are not going to join forces. This has been told to me many times because I care about Cuba and I travel the world raising questions about Cuba or Venezuela. So when you say, you know, what about those, free speech in Cuba, freedom of religion in Cuba, freedom of association? You know that we have never heard about a strike in Cuba. Why there are no strikes in Cuba? Because there are not independent unions in Cuba, are not allowed. So when you try to create a debate outside the US, in Mexico, for instance, which has a lot of influence in Cuba, the natural reaction of those ones who should be supporting human rights in Cuba is, what about the embargo? We don't support the embargo. And then you try to divide the conversation and say, you know, let's discuss the embargo later. Let's focus on Cuba now, you know. And the rest of the world is not willing to make that.
Let me interrupt you just for 1 second, and thank you for that answer. I mean, a lot of people believed, including myself, maybe that there was going to be an opening when the Soviet Union imploded. When the Soviet Union imploded, a lot of us thought, well, this is a satellite state, really, of the Soviet Union, and there's going to be change in Cuba. But it didn't really happen because they continue to have support from other countries around the globe. And they continue to have it. So in a practical sense, when you say that Western democracy should kick in, well, I think they should, but if they do, how will that really make a difference if they're getting support from these other countries? If Cuba is getting support from other countries, of course, that don't like us very much, it still seems like they will carry on. I mean, that's what people want to know. How, in a practical sense, can we make a difference with the reality on the ground there in the international reality as it is? How can we make a difference?
The only, look, I sound like a broken record, but the best way to contribute constructively to the Cuban debate is by looking into your own policy and make a very objective, empirical assessment of whether that policy has been effective or has failed. My conclusion is has failed because, you know, you have a very strong dictatorship in place. So it's time to introduce some adjustments. Former President Obama didn't lift the policy of isolation. What he did was to reestablish diplomatic relations with Cuba. But the heavy lifting, the work needs to be done here in Congress. If this policy is not subject of a real and serious, objective, non-partisan, you know, evaluation, we will keep the status quo, and I bet you that nothing will change in Cuba.
Thank you. I have more questions, but my time's up, so I will yield. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman. Congresswoman Salazar.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I have a couple of questions for both of you. Let me start with you, Rosa Maria. Basically, yes or no. If the White House gives green light to connect internet, either through Guantanamo or Raven Company or the U.S. Embassy in the middle of El Manacón, will the Cubans go back into the streets?
The Cubans are already in the streets.
But more and more.
Of course, of course. I mean, that connection allows communication and allows coordination.
Do you think that more Cubans will feel emboldened because they know that the world is watching them because of the Wi-Fi?
That's very important. That's key. I do think that, and I do think that everybody needs to send the message to the Cuban people that they are not alone.
But if the Biden administration is not saying clearly that that the Biden administration of the United States government is with the Cuban people, are they receiving that information?
The best way to be with the Cuban people is with real actions, and internet is one of them.
Right. Now, what else can we do besides forcing the Biden administration to give the green light so we can turn on the internet right now, which is the most effective manner through the embassy or in Guantanamo with a tower, a Wi-Fi tower? We're not talking about Netflix quality video. We're talking about just the ability to lift the videos that show how they're being beaten on the streets. What else could we do besides that?
Yeah, you could please help us to put these recommendations on the radar of the president, and please also do it as not just personal recommendations, but actually these are the suggestions, the recommendations of the majority of the Cuban civil society and opposition that took part of a platform called Pasos de Cambio.
But unfortunately, the Biden administration is not paying attention to us or to the Cuban people, which is the most important part. So then I go to Mr. Vivanco, where you're saying I've been hearing you repeat once and many times that we need the international community to join the United States in order to create change in Cuba. But then my question is now, putting the embargo aside, putting politics aside, where is the international community now when they see that the people are shouting on the streets? That has nothing to do with the Americans or with the embargo. Where is that international community?
Unfortunately, the reaction of the international community is not, up to the level
And why is that?
is required.
Why is that? What do you think that is?
Because, unfortunately, let me cite you an example. The current president of Argentina, Alberto Fernandez.
Yes.
He says, I have no idea what is going on in Cuba, but I am against the embargo. So that is very unfortunate reaction. And he is the leader of a democratic country. It's not a dictatorship. This is not, we are not looking into Russia or China. It's one of the biggest democracies in Latin America. And he seems to be, somebody who should be aware about what is going on in Cuba.
So everything is the embargo, but then if you're telling me that he doesn't even know what's happening in Cuba, so that means that they don't care what's happening, and like I repeat, what's happening in Cuba has nothing to do with the embargo. But then, and I want you to tell me where I'm wrong in this statement. You lift the embargo as you are advocating the United States to do. Then the Castro brothers will have access to loans, specifically from the World Bank and from the IMF, and everybody will be doing business with Cuba because there is no more American embargo on it, right? And then what happens? Then accordingly, I go back to Obama, then what happens next? We will then have given oxygen to a repressive apparatus to continue repressing the Cubans. And then where is the democracy in this whole picture?
Let me answer your question, and I think it's also relevant for the comment that made by Congressman Green. He said, and I believe and I agree with you, Congressman Green, you said, I don't believe that lifting the embargo will bring change and democracy overnight in Cuba.
So then we have to wait, what, 50 years?
I agree 100%. Agree 100%. So in other words, this is not a trickle-down economic. It's not like you lift the embargo, then bingo, you have democracy in Cuba the following day. What you need is a multilateral pressure, and you need to build that one, and that will take time to build up, diplomacy with democracies in the world.
But that depends on those democracies. And I agree. That depends on those democracies. And you just pointed out the fact that those democracies are just not tuned in. So we do not, if they will at some point. So one way or the other, we do not know when democracy is going to get to Cuba. But in the meantime, the Cubans are on the street and no one is paying attention, including the Biden administration. That's reality.
Thank you, Congresswoman.
Thank you. Sorry, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the time.
Debbie Wasserman-Schultz.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to turn to the subject of Cuban doctors and just reference a March 2019 report by the New York Times that detailed how members of Cuba's medical mission in Venezuela said that they were told to provide oxygen tanks and other desperately needed medical assistance only to individuals who committed to voting for the Maduro regime. In multiple cases, they described being ordered to withhold life-saving treatment to individuals who hadn't proven their political loyalty to Maduro. Are these medical missions still going on in Venezuela, and what has been their impact to either one of you?
Yes, they have been taking place in Venezuela and in many other countries, and it is very important that not only United States, not only the United Nations that actually issue a report elevating the Cuban Medical Brigade's treatment to the treatment of forced labor. And it's very important that the rest of the world restrained for participating in this kind of activities that are designed to give money to the Cuban repressors, passing over the life and the human rights of the Cuban doctors. But you made a very good point, because it's not these international missions that the Cuban regime has around the world are not just for money, are also for espionage. And I have a very specific data from the Cuban medical missions that took place in Bolivia during the Evo Morales presidency. From 503 medical doctors or supposed medical doctors working on Venezuela, 497 were not medical graduates. So that the inversion that the Bolivian state was making in medicine or health was actually being made on espionage and Cuban state security.
And Senor Vivanco, you mentioned earlier that the exportation of Cuban doctors has been helpful in some countries, but compare that with the information coming out of Cuba in terms of the reality of healthcare on the island, where even in Havana, pregnant women are required to bring their own sheets, that they actually have to bring cleansers so that they can clean the feces off of the walls and the toilets so that they can have some semblance of sanitary conditions to give birth. Can either of you describe the facade, the real lies, fabrications of the wonderment that is portrayed of how excellent the Cuban healthcare system is, compared to the reality of it being rationed and individuals, particularly of Afro-Cuban descent, are actually discriminated against when it comes to access to healthcare?
Just a couple of points. I do believe that the Cuban doctors, those ones who are doctors, I'm not talking about spies, Cuban doctors are heroes and should and deserve as much as respect as we could give them.
Right,
because
my
they
criticism
go.
is not of them.
Say it again?
My criticism is not of them.
No, that's why.
I think they're being enslaved.
It's very important to make that distinction between the doctors who goes to, remote and poor communities all over the world to service them from the machinery, the structure used by the Cuban government, where the doctors become actually victims, and they have no rights, no right to privacy, freedom of speech, association, and so on and so forth. By the way, the chair of the subcommittee asked me before, what happened if any of those doctors apply for political asylum, for instance, and abandon the mission?
If you could focus specifically on the reality of healthcare access and conditions on the island.
I don't have that data, the current data of reliable data
Ms. Paya,
of the current.
Yeah, I don't have data because we don't have statistics, but we have seen videos, and we are in total connection with the Cuban in the island, and the reality seems to be of a total collapse of the healthcare system, at least in the provinces of Matanzas. The people were even Matanzas, yes. The people were even dying in the aisles and in the entrance and in the houses without proper medical attention. We are facing a very hard crisis of the sanitary system, of the healthcare system, and it's clear that the authorities of the dictatorship are not capable of actually solving the problem. They are not prepared, or they are not willing to.
Mr. Chairman, the portrayal of the Cuban healthcare system is mythological, that it is one that provides all kinds of free and wonderful access to healthcare to people on the island. That is simply untrue. And in addition to that, the reason that we don't have the information that we need is because they deny access to the data, unlike free countries, which universally share data so that everyone can have access to it and see what's really going on in terms of the treatment and the health and well-being of their people. I yield back to
Thank you, Congresswoman. Congressman Perry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank the witnesses. I read a book one time entitled "And the Russian State," talking about Cuba. Now, the folks that are for ending the embargo, some sitting at the table, some on the other side of the aisle here in this building, and most, I think importantly and vociferously, the Chinese, the Russians, and the Cuban dictatorship. I think that's an interesting coalition, and it's important to recognize it for what it is. Ms. Paya, can you describe to us, if you can, because we've heard the reports, but it's hard to get verification, what are the Venezuelans and the Russians and the Chinese doing in Cuba right now to stomp out this freedom movement?
Yes, and again, we only know what is public. We only know what the anecdotes of the witness in Cuba mentioned. But just taking into consideration what is public, Russia issued a statement in the first days of last week, encouraging Miguel Díaz-Canel, the puppet of Raúl Castro, which hold the charge of president of the dictatorship, encouraging Díaz-Canel to use all the measurements available within the Cuban law to stop the protest. That were not the exact words, but that was the message. And I have to say, to use all the measurements within the Cuban law includes the violence, includes the weapons against the Cubans that are actually trying to change the system, because actually the Cuban Constitution that was imposed in 2019 in the Article 4, that Constitution allows anyone to fight, even using they call it lucha armada, even using weapons to fight anyone that is trying to change the political and the economical system that Constitution established, which is the Cuban Communist Party as the director of the society and the state. So basically, Putin was given his endorsement to the killing of the Cubans in the streets if they were trying to change the system. Having said so, Cuba, the Cuban regime have been the gateway to the intelligence service of Chinese, of Russians, and the connections, the coordination, the kind of relationship that the Cuban regime has over the Maduro dictatorship have been widely documented, and they are in charge, for instance, of the counterintelligence, specifically the military counterintelligence. So that's scary enough.
So everyone knows the Russians and the Chinese have their most important listening stations located in Cuba, right? And so if people are saying, well, Mr. Vivanco, the embargo's not working, and I agree with you to a certain extent that doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results is insanity, and for 60 years. And before that with Batista, the same thing, right? Dictatorship and us with the embargo now and hoping it will work. But I would submit to you that while I agree with you that it's not working under its current form because other countries are happy to trade with Cuba, they're happy to trade because there's something in it for them. There's money in it for them. There's influence. There's China. There's Russia. And this is the time. Right now is the time when the United States, with the embargo, needs to step up and do even more as the Cuban people put their lives on the line, literally on the streets of Cuba, at the hands of the Venezuelans, at the hands of the Chinese and the Russians, who will kill them in their homes. And now's the time for the United States to up the ante, to say we even go to these other countries and say, you must stop trading with them. You must stop helping. Now is the time. Not to back off, not to do exactly what the dictatorship wants. Ms. Paya, certainly the Cuban people can defend themselves against the Venezuelan police, the Russians, the Chinese. Certainly they can defend themselves. They're armed, aren't they?
No, they are disarmed.
Say it isn't so.
And peaceful people demanding freedom in the streets, and they are confronting a state with all its resources and the resources of the other enemies of freedom to the world.
Ladies and gentlemen, now is the time for the United States to lead, not back off on the embargo, but to step up and force other countries, demand other countries to step up and stop the insanity happening 90 miles off our coast. I yield the balance.
Thank you, Congressman. Congressman Burgers.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I believe it was Albert Einstein who was credited with saying, if you do the same thing over and over again and you expect a different result, that's insanity. And I think that that's right. I mean, if you continue to do the same thing, expect a different result, that is insanity. I'd argue, I mean, everybody's putting the blame, it seems like, not everybody, but some people seem to be putting the blame on this administration. But I would say, hey, where was the Reagan administration? Where was the George H.W. administration? Where was the George W. administration? Where was the Trump administration? If it's so easy to do, why wasn't it done? I mean, the reality is I think it's very difficult to get change there, and again, because it does have, I think, these other states that help it. I gave the chance last time, Ms. Paya, to Mr. Ivanko. How would you do it differently? Because it does seem to me that nothing's going to come of all this. That you're going to have a lot of poor people suffering in Cuba again. You're going to have this, you know, the people in the streets. They're going to get repressed. They're going to get attacked. A lot of them, not a lot, but a number of them are going to get killed. They're going to disappear. All the terrible things that normally happen, and nothing's going to change because we're going to continue to do the same thing.
Congressman Vargas, I do appreciate the analysis of the history, because I do believe that we are in a pivotal moment, that this moment is qualitatively different from anything that we have seen before in these 62 years. We have seen massive protests across the whole island, tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of Cubans, maybe a million of Cubans in the streets demanding freedom and demanding the end of the dictatorship, demanding those things from a dictatorship that actually is in one of the most vulnerable moments in history too, for many reasons, but also because the access to resources have been diminished during the last years, but especially because the Cuban people have fundamentally changed in its behavior, and is going out in the streets and is demanding freedom, not just on Sunday, but only during this year till June 30. There have been more than 1,100 protests in Cuba. So there are many fresh and important things that the international community and the United States can do to help us. And one of these is raise the cost of the repression against the Cuban people, imposing targeted individual sanctions against the ones that are giving the orders to kill and to shut down young people in the streets. Internet access.
If I could interrupt,
Yeah.
But I have to say, I mean, I'm old enough to remember the collapse of the Soviet Union, and that was also a moment like this, when everyone said, "Oh, here it comes. Here's where it's going to be the big change." There wasn't.
With all due respect, you're talking about the collapse of the Soviet Union,
but remember,
I'm
Cuba,
talking about the Cuban people.
No, I understand, but the reason I say that is that history seems to repeat itself. I remember that time. I mean, I'm 60 years old. I don't know how old you are, but I'm 60.
32.
And so I remember that time very well, that this is an opportunity. Everybody's saying, now it's going to happen. There's going to be change on the island. You're going to see now a democracy. The Castros are going to fall. They didn't.
Okay,
and now I look at it again, and I don't want to argue with you, because I agree. I'd like to see the change, probably we both like to see. I'd like to see a democracy where people can vote freely for whomever they want and not have the dictatorship that they have today. I just fear that we're going to do the same thing again, and nothing is going to change.
Well, you can help us to change that, and that's part of why we are doing this. And just to clarify, what is fundamentally different from 1990s is that it's not the Soviet Union collapsing; it's the Cuban people protesting in the streets. The protagonic role here doesn't rely on any other foreign country, but relied on the Cuban people. We are the protagonists of our history. We are already being that. And what we are asking is solidarity with the solution and the demand
But I guess if I
that
could just,
we
'cause
are.
my time's about over, that's the problem, the solution. I mean, I think that there's a lot of solidarity. There was back when the Soviet Union collapsed too, and nothing happened. That's my point, that the solidarity was there, but it's the policy that doesn't change.
Then
If you
practical
keep-
things to do. Rise the cost of the repression, impose targeted sanctions over those that are still commanding repression, give internet access without the censorship of the Cuban regime, apply the Sullivan principles, and take a similar approach to the one that you took with South Africa to end the apartheid. Involve the international community, the European Union, the OAS, not under the premise of the cynicism of the world with the embargo, but on the premise of the Cuban people demanding freedom on the streets. I think that would be a fresh approach.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
My time's up.
Thank you, Congressman Vargas. Congresswoman Melotakis.
Thank you very much, and I again want to thank both of you for being here today and to discuss a topic that is very personal and important to me. And certainly we talked a lot about what the Biden administration should be doing, and I echo what you say, Ms. Paya, when you say we need to involve the international community. We need to speak. We need the president to lead as the leader of the free world. To push for freedom and democracy in Cuba, and certainly use whatever abilities we have to engage the international community, the freedom-loving democracies from around the world, to also join that effort to push this regime out. What I want to ask, though, is what can the United Nations, because I've been very disappointed with their lack of interest in actually assisting in this situation right now, what do you believe the United Nations should be doing at this time to help this cause?
Thank you so much for that question. And I have to say that, I have been shut down by the Cuban, by the dictatorship, the ambassador of the Cuban dictatorship in the Human Rights Councils in the United Nations. And the fact that they have a seat there is already very telling to what the United Nations have been doing for the Cuban people. Anyways, they are special rapporteurs that have to make his work, their work, and they have been doing it, and those kind of technical approach as the one that reported on the forced labors of the Cuban doctors should be taken into consideration. My suggestion, of course, I'm hoping that the High Representative Michelle Bachelet asked for a visit to the island and actually confirmed with her own eyes what is taking place in Cuba. I don't bear a lot of hope for the Cuban regime accepting that, but that should be the kind of bold involvement that we are hoping for an organization that should be protecting the right to democracy and the human rights in Cuba.
You mentioned the Human Rights Council, and I'm glad you brought it up, because one of the reasons why President Trump withdrew the United States from the Human Rights Council is because it's a farce. It's an absolute sham, particularly when you look at the members who sit on that council. It's not just Cuba who allows no freedom of speech, no freedom of press, no freedom to demonstrate, as we're seeing people being beat in the streets by communist regime forces. They're being abducted and jailed and shot at. They're treated as slaves for what equates to $15 US a month. They have the dual currency system. They're being paid in Cuban pesos, and yet they're being asked to purchase things in something that is equivalent of US dollars, and when it's a 25-to-1 ratio, how do you expect them to do that? And they're slaves to the government. And they don't have the right to come and go from the island as they please. So the fact that Cuba is on the Human Rights Council, along with China, Venezuela, Russia, the most egregious human rights violators. Mr. Vivanco, as somebody who is involved with the Human Rights Watch, I would love for you to comment on that.
It is a shame. It is a shame. There is no other, reaction. That is probably the most honest comment that I can give you. How dictatorship are members of the Human Rights Council. But let me explain to you one little detail, which I think is relevant. They get elected because every region, every geographical region of the world has a chance to present, for instance, one or two candidates for one or two vacancies. Last time, when Venezuela was, competing for a position, unfortunately, Latin America were giving 2 posts, and Latin America as a region presented 2 candidates for 2 posts. So there was, I mean, and one of the candidates was Venezuela, the other one was Brazil. And Brazil, under the current government of President Bolsonaro, very close ally to former President Trump, you know, decided to avoid any further candidate from stepping in because they were afraid that if there were 3 candidates for 2 posts at the Human Rights Council, Brazil will be eliminated. So what we did was to convince Costa Rica in the last minute to run to try to defeat Venezuela. And Costa Rica did it, but you know, it was late already. You know, and unfortunately, finally, Brazil was elected and Venezuela was elected.
Any advice you have for the Biden administration at this moment when they're looking to re-enter Human Rights Council, how we can use that as leverage to try to change the makeup of this council?
I think that if you look at the votes, the positions of the Human Rights Council, not the membership. The membership, I agree with you. I mean, at least, I don't know, 40% of them are dictatorship who get selected at the Human Rights Council to protect themselves. You know, to try to interfere in the business of the top entity that is supposed to supervise human rights all over the world. But there is still a slim majority that is committed to fundamental freedoms and rights. So I welcome the decision of the current administration, the Biden administration, to rejoin the Human Rights Council because there are very important battles and debates that are happening precisely there.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, we come to the end. I want to thank you for your patience. I want to thank you for coming and testifying before our committee. And we'll just have some closing remarks and we'll close the hearing. Thank you again for joining us today. I have been inspired by the scenes of courage we are witnessing in Cuba. Young people in particular have been stepping up and making clear, excuse me, that they refuse to become a lost generation. Their creativity, bravery, and advocacy are a reminder that the status quo in Cuba is a tremendous waste of talent and potential. I urge the Biden administration and my colleagues in Congress to rise to the occasion and seize this opportunity to help the Cuban people. Nothing is more important to me than seeing the Cuban people finally become free. With that, I turn it over to my colleague, Congressman Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for allowing some closing comments. And I want to thank the witnesses for being here. I want to thank you for your intensity. I think on both, everybody here is excited about the opportunity that we see at this moment in time. We're frustrated and angry with the human rights abuses that have gone on for so many years. And I agree that with the embargo not working, I think it's time to double down. I think it's time, and my criticisms aren't of the Biden administration per se as much about, you know, earlier when I was talking about socialism and communism, and I was referring to sort of fringe members. I think we all know the senator I'm talking about who supports socialism, and my own colleagues here in the House who support socialism, and some who've advocated for universal rent control, which is right out of Karl Marx. I'm not saying that's the Biden administration. I'm saying my criticism there is let's act. It's time. And there's a chance, there's an opportunity to bring freedom to another group of people. And that's why I'm so passionate. But I believe very deeply that there's a lot of, I was listening to, you know, Congresswoman Wasserman Schultz, who I don't agree with very often, but as she was talking about this, I'm like, yes, that's right. Those physicians are enslaved. And if they're doing that, they'll probably sell vaccine we give them anyway, right? So, I mean, let's do what we can to continue to agree where we can. And Chairman Sears, I just want to thank you for your friendship and your unbelievable leadership on this issue over the decades. You are a champion for the people of Cuba because you are one of them. And you have done an amazing job leading through the challenges of a divided government here in Washington, D.C. Thanks for your time. Appreciate y'all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman Green, for those remarks, and thank you for your comments. And with that, this hearing is adjourned.